Syphilis physical manifestations, planets and houses. The Syphilis Miasm in homeopathy is primarily associated with destruction, degeneration, and structural breakdown in the body. Physically, it often manifests as tissue destruction, ulceration, suppuration, and bone and joint deformities. These destructive tendencies can be analysed through specific planetary influences, particularly focusing on Ketu, but also involving other malefic planets such as Saturn, Mars, and Rahu, which contribute to physical degeneration. Tissue destruction, ulceration, and suppuration. Tissue destruction, ulcers, and suppuration, the formation of pus, are key physical manifestations of syphilis. These conditions are linked to planetary influences that represent chronic illnesses, inflammation, and degenerative processes in the body. Key planets. Ketu represents degeneration, breakdown, and chronic diseases. When Ketu is afflicted or poorly placed, it accelerates tissue destruction, causing ulcers, wounds that do not heal, and chronic infections. Mars governs inflammation and acute conditions. When Mars is afflicted or in conjunction with Ketu, it can lead to severe inflammatory conditions such as ulcers, abscesses, and skin lesions that fester and break down. Saturn represents chronic conditions, slow healing, and degenerative processes. Saturn's influence, especially when combined with Ketu or Mars, slows the healing of ulcers and exacerbates tissue destruction. Rahu is associated with toxins, poisons, and abnormalities. When it influences the body in conjunction with Ketu, it can worsen tissue destruction, lead to pus formation, and create unhealed wounds, boils, or ulcers. Key houses governs disease, illness, and healing processes. If this house or its ruler is afflicted by Ketu, Mars, or Saturn, it can lead to chronic ulcers, non-healing wounds, abscesses, and persistent infections that cause tissue destruction. 8th house governs degeneration, death, and hidden diseases. Affliction here, particularly by Ketu or Mars, leads to internal ulcers, tissue degeneration, and deep-seated infections that are hard to treat or heal. 12th house associated with chronic and hidden illnesses. The 12th house afflicted by Ketu, Saturn, or Mars can manifest as suppurative conditions, including festering wounds, abscesses, and ulcers that persist over time. Hala conjunctions. Ketu plus Mars. This combination represents aggressive tissue destruction, chronic ulcers, and inflammatory conditions that result in suppuration. Ulcers or skin lesions may break down, fester, and produce pus, particularly if this conjunction occurs in the 6th or 8th houses. Leads to slow healing, chronic wounds, and ulcers that refuse to heal properly. The tissue destruction here is more gradual but persistent, with a tendency towards scarring and degeneration of affected areas. Rahu, Ketu. This combination can cause abnormal tissue growths, tumours or ulcers that turn suppurative and refuse to heal, especially if positioned in the 6th or 12th houses. Bone and joint deformities. In syphilis, the physical body can experience structural breakdown, particularly in the bones and joints, leading to deformities, chronic pain, and restricted mobility. These issues are tied to planetary energies that influence bone health and the skeletal system. Key planets. Saturn represents the skeletal system, chronic conditions, and bone health. When Saturn is afflicted or combined with malefic influences, it can lead to bone deterioration, joint deformities, arthritis, and conditions like osteoporosis. Ketu accelerates degeneration and breakdown in the body. Ketu's affliction can lead to bone deformities, dislocation of joints, or erosion of the skeletal structure. Mars governs inflammation and heat. When Mars influences the bones, particularly when in a challenging position with Saturn or Ketu, it can lead to inflammatory joint diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis or painful conditions in the bones like osteomyelitis. Rahu can create abnormalities in bone structure, deformities, or unusual growths. When Rahu is involved with Saturn or Ketu, it can lead to skeletal abnormalities and conditions that cause deformities. Key houses. 1st house ascendant governs overall physical health and constitution, including bone structure. If the ascendant or its lord is afflicted by Saturn, Ketu, or Mars, the native may experience bone weakness, joint pain, or deformities. 10th house represents the knees, bones, and the skeletal system. If this house or its ruler is afflicted by Saturn, Ketu, or Mars, it can manifest as chronic joint pain, arthritis, knee deformities, or bone degeneration. 8th house governs degenerative and transformative processes. When afflicted by Saturn or Ketu, the 8th house can indicate chronic bone conditions such as osteoarthritis, bone deformities, or conditions that weaken the skeletal structure over time. 6th house, associated with health and chronic disease, afflictions here by Saturn or Mars can indicate bone-related diseases such as arthritis, bone spurs, or degeneration of joints. Conjunctions. Saturn plus Ketu. This combination is strongly associated with chronic bone conditions and deformities. The native may experience joint stiffness, degeneration, or deformities in bones, particularly if this combination is found in the 1st, 6th, or 10th houses. Mars plus Saturn. This combination can lead to inflammatory joint diseases and bone degeneration. The native may experience chronic pain, swelling, and deformities, especially in the knees, spine, or joints. Ketu plus Rahu creates abnormal bone growth or deformities. When positioned in the 1st or 10th houses, it can manifest as skeletal abnormalities, unusual bone formations, or congenital deformities in the joints or bones. By analyzing these planetary influences and house placements, we can better understand how the syphilis miasm physically manifests in the body through tissue destruction, ulceration, suppuration, and bone and joint deformities. These conditions reflect the degenerative nature of the syphilis miasm and how it erodes the body's structure over time. Ulceration and suppuration are characteristic manifestations of the syphilis miasm, where tissues break down and pus formation occurs. These conditions are indicative of deep, chronic infections and degeneration, driven by specific planetary influences that govern decay, inflammation, and chronic disease processes. Key planets. Ketu. As the planet of detachment and degeneration, Ketu plays a dominant role in the formation of ulcers and suppurative conditions. Its influence leads to non-healing ulcers, chronic infections, and tissue breakdown, especially when it afflicts health-related houses. Mars governs heat, inflammation, and acute conditions. When Mars is afflicted, especially when connected with Ketu or Saturn, it can cause inflammatory conditions that lead to the development of ulcers, abscesses, and the formation of pus. Mars brings the aggressive, destructive force necessary for such severe tissue reactions. Saturn slows the healing process and exacerbates chronic conditions. When Saturn is involved with Ketu or Mars, it causes ulcers to heal slowly, become deeper, and lead to persistent infections that result in suppuration and scarring. Rahu represents toxins, abnormalities, and unusual growths. Rahu's influence in health-related houses can lead to the presence of chronic, festering wounds that are difficult to heal and tend to produce pus, especially when combined with Ketu or Mars. Key houses. 6th house. This house governs disease, infection, and healing processes. Affliction of the 6th house by Ketu, Mars, or Saturn often leads to non-healing ulcers, abscesses, and chronic suppuration. The native may suffer from infections that are resistant to treatment and prone to pus formation. 8th house, associated with deep hidden conditions, degeneration, and long-standing illnesses. When Ketu or Mars afflict the 8th house, the individual may suffer from internal ulcers or degenerative diseases that involve the breakdown of tissues and chronic infections that produce pus. 12th house represents hidden chronic illnesses and long-term health issues. When afflicted by Ketu, Saturn, or Mars, this house can lead to ulcers or abscesses that are difficult to detect and treat, with recurring pus formation and festering wounds. 1st house, ascendant, governs the body's overall health and immune response. Afflictions by Ketu, Mars, or Saturn can cause the body to be prone to ulcers, wounds that do not heal properly, and chronic skin conditions that involve the breakdown of tissues and suppuration. Has conjunctions. Ketu plus Mars. This combination is particularly aggressive and destructive, leading to inflamed, non-healing ulcers, abscesses, and conditions where tissues break down and become infected. Pus formation is common, especially if this combination affects the 6th, 8th, or 12th houses. Ketu plus Saturn causes chronic, slow-healing ulcers and persistent infections. The tissue breakdown in this case is gradual but relentless, with a tendency toward deep ulcers and suppuration that can last for long periods. Rahu Ketu. This combination can cause strange or unusual ulcers and abscesses, with abnormal patterns of tissue destruction and pus formation. These wounds may resist conventional treatment, especially when found in the 6th or 8th houses. Understanding these planetary influences in relation to the specific health-related houses gives insight into how the Syphilis Miasm manifests in chronic ulceration and suppuration. These conditions reflect the underlying degenerative and destructive nature of this miasm in homeopathy, driven by a combination of afflicted planets and their placements in the natal chart.